Greetings, folks. Another episode of Maroon Getaway, life examined by an aspiring 21st century Maroon. The world turned upside down. This is 5. The world turned upside down. Predators and prey in times of growth and in times of ecological release. However such predation occurs, it must somehow be justified, at least in the minds of predators, if not in those of prey as well. Yeah, it's interesting. Religion served this function in many ancient complex societies. The followers of the true faith, quote unquote, having been given divine license to subjugate non-believers, while economic and political ideology do so today more frequently. Priests serve the kings of ancient civilizations, channeling myths and rituals that valorized the divine right of the monarch. The king claimed ultimate ownership of everything and everybody within the borders of the state, as ordained by the dictates of the sky god. Again, whichever variant of the sky god you want to use, of which he was regarded as an earthly embodiment. Later, as the state became more culturally diverse and more secularized, philosophers and economists served a function similar to that of the ancient priesthood, explaining why the rich deserved their riches and the poor their poverty, and why everyone owed loyalty to the state, the economic system, or both. One ideological system for the justification of predation stands out as particularly influential in the last few hundred years, namely racism. So again, this is very interesting that he has really zeroed in on this particular factor, because if one could be as objective as possible in really examining the history of the last 500 years, easily since since the 16th century, the construct of racism has loomed large and really shaping everything that we now know of in the modern world. And the understanding that racism is a construct. It is not an actual reality. It is not scientific in the truest sense of the word, in that there's no true, legitimate empirical evidence to give the idea any kind of credence. The circumstances that gave rise to racism centered on the brutal and blatant form of predation involving the kidnapping and intergenerational enslavement of Africans by Europeans and European Americans. The practice occurred within wealthy, sophisticated societies that fancied themselves rational, moral, and religious. Thus, it required a new and compelling ideological basis. Now, this is where I kind of want to just stop for a minute. Now, what he's basically talking about is the creation of a cosmology, right? So when I say the creation of a cosmology, there's a way that you have to sort of order the universe, or the one that you think you live in order for you to be able to justify or make sense of what it is that you're doing. So in this particular instance, that you have to assign a particular value to, in this case, certain groups of people that you want to be able to do certain things to, at least to kind of trick yourself into believing that you have a legitimate basis upon which to do the things that you're doing, in order to sort of put yourself at ease, even though it ultimately doesn't put you at ease, right? So you kind of have to come up with these very elaborate explanations so that you can basically lie to yourself and also lie to other people, even though eventually this is creating a type of turbulence that is eventually going to have to be dealt with, and this turbulence ends up sort of manifesting itself in a number of different ways. So so before the 15th century, the European slave trade centered on East European Slavs, hence the term slave. By the 1400s, the Slavs had improved their self-defenses, and slave traders turned to Africa for victims. As Portuguese Prince Henry, the Navigator, explored the West African coast in the early 15th century, searching for sources of wealth, his chronicler, Gomes Yanes de Zurara, I believe that's how I probably mispronounced that, Zurara, described the burgeoning Portuguese slave trade, categorizing Africans as a separate and inferior black race and Europeans as a quote-unquote white and superior race. previously white had not existed as a racial category. Now I'll stop here. The idea that somehow you could take all Europeans and put them under one umbrella is preposterous, because if anybody knows anything about European history, I mean, these are people that have been fighting each other for a very long time. So it's not, so even if you go to places like the British Isles, it's not like the English saw themselves as the same as the Irish, the Welsh, or the Scots. It's absurd. So even the legitimizing this as a category that actually has any kind of actual real application in terms of these are people who can identify with having some kind of common experience, a way of like seeing the world, is it doesn't have any, it's not tied to history in any way. So you have to think that there's another function here. Again, this is a gross, I mean, it's a ridiculous oversimplification. I mean, it's as ridiculous as saying, again, all black people can all be seen as the same. Again, gross oversimplification, ridiculous. I mean, even in terms of phenotype and sort of genetic identification, I mean, some of the greatest genetic differences between peoples you'll have, for instance, on the African continent, between different kinds of black people, right? So the idea that somehow they could all be put under one umbrella is, as a matter of sort of science or empiricism, is absurd. You have to sort of create a justification which allows for you to be able to even entertain this as a possibility. And again, understanding that, well, there must be some other function, right? That it has to serve some other purpose, aside from it having any kind of legitimacy in terms of kind of the reality that we live in, right? You have to create a reality. You have to reorder the universe to make it fit whatever it is that you are trying to make it. Actually, I want to mention a book here. Actually, a few books that actually goes into this further. These are books that actually go into the identification, the creation of the identification of white as a category. There's a book written by a woman named Dr. Janet Batalora called Birth of a White Nation, The Invention of White People and Its Relevance Today. She says as a legal category from her research, white didn't even exist. White, quote unquote, didn't even exist as a legal category until the year 1681. So this is late 17th century. Theodore W. Allen, he has a book called The Invention of the White Race, Volume 1, Racial Oppression and Social Control. Noel Ignatieff, How the Irish Became White. There's some other writings, but those are three good places to begin and just, again, unpack this idea of the creation of categories which allow a certain economic regime, again, to be put into place. So you have, again, this creation of a cosmology to put into place a particular economic regime. And again, I think previously I talked about this book called The Empire of Things, which then begins to talk about how this whole idea of the human being as consumer and how and the role that slavery played in the bringing to life this conception of people and consumption first started. And again, that also started in, I think, the 1500s, 16th century. So the idea caught on among other Europeans who drew on textual sources from classical antiquity to sort humans into groups based on physical appearance, attributing deeply ingrained behaviors and capacities to those groups. Quickly, the notion arose that people of the allegedly superior, quote-unquote, white race were not only right in enslaving what amounted cumulatively to several million inferior people of color, quote-unquote, but were doing God's work by bringing civilization to the savages, quote-unquote. An idea later encapsulated in the title of Rudyard Kipling's poem, The White Man's Burden.